Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a rigorous academic teardown of something you and I experience literally every single day, yet rarely see the underlying mechanics of. We are going to unpack the foundational blueprint of human persuasion, Aristotle's Rhetoric. Written over 2 millennia ago, this text isn't just some dusty historical artifact, it's a meticulously structured, incredibly relevant system for understanding exactly how human beings influence one another through language. Let's get started.
Aristotle kicks things off with a pretty bold claim. He isn't treating rhetoric as some random parlor trick, and definitely not as the dark, manipulative art his teacher Plato sometimes worried it was. Instead, he establishes it as an observable, systematic counterpart to strict logic. Look at this quote right at the top of Book 1. Rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. To truly understand rhetoric, we've got to understand this relationship first.
So let's look at this comparison. Dialectic and rhetoric, they're basically two sides of the exact same coin, but they operate in totally different environments. Where dialectic is all about seeking absolute truth through strict scientific logic and syllogisms, usually between experts in a vacuum, rhetoric navigates the messy, unpredictable world of probabilities and human decisions. Rhetoric is built for the public square, for the untrained thinker, and for those real-world situations where the outcome could genuinely go more than one way.
Here is our syllabus for today's academic teardown. We'll define the art itself, deconstruct the 3 modes of persuasion, look at the branches of oratory, peek under the hood at the engine of proof, and finally wrap it all up with style and arrangement.
All right, Section 1, Defining the Art of Persuasion. Look really closely at the precise language Aristotle uses here. It's fascinating. He strictly defines rhetoric not as the act of actually winning the argument, but as the faculty of observing. It's a cognitive ability, right? It is the analytical power to look at any given situation, any audience, and observe all the potential levers you could pull to persuade them. Whether you actually win the debate or not, if you can map out those available means, you're a master of rhetoric. Moving right along to Section 2. The 3 modes of persuasion. According to Aristotle, the spoken word gives us 3 distinct tools, or modes of persuasion. Number 1 is ethos, that's the speaker's personal character. 2 is pathos, tapping into the emotional state of the audience. And 3 is logos, the actual apparent proof provided by the words and logic of the speech itself. Every single persuasive message you will ever hear relies on some combination of these 3 pillars.
Let's zoom in on that first one. Aristotle actually argues that ethos is probably the single most effective means of persuasion you possess. Think about it. We naturally believe good people more fully and readily than others, especially when absolute certainty is impossible. But how do you actually build it? Well, the text tells us a speaker has to project 3 specific traits: good sense, good moral character, and goodwill toward the audience. And here's the real kicker. This credibility needs to be achieved by what the speaker actually says during the speech, not just by relying on whatever the audience thought of them before they even opened their mouth. Okay, Section 3, the 3 branches of oratory.
Now this matrix is brilliant. Aristotle divides all rhetoric into 3 distinct branches, and they're governed entirely by the listener and the time frame. First, you've got political or deliberative speaking, which deals with the future. Its purpose is to argue whether a proposed action is expedient or harmful. Second, forensic or legal speaking deals with the past, focusing heavily on justice or injustice, who actually committed the act. Finally, ceremonial or epidictic speaking deals primarily with the present, and its singular aim is to assign honor or disgrace to a subject. Once you see this matrix, it's wild. You realize that every political debate, every courtroom trial, or even that awkward wedding toast you heard last weekend perfectly follows this ancient blueprint.
Which brings us to Section 4, the engine of proof. So ask yourself this: beyond the emotional pull of pathos and the inherent trust of ethos, what is the actual mechanical, logical engine that makes an argument demonstrably persuasive to a crowd?
The answer is the enthymeme. Now, this is the absolute beating heart of Aristotle's logical framework. An enthymeme is essentially a rhetorical syllogism, but remember, we are dealing with the general public here. So an enthymeme is built on probabilities and signs, rather than strict scientific truths, and it's specifically designed for an audience of untrained thinkers to follow easily. To pull this off, it uses fewer propositions than a normal logical syllogism, intentionally leaving familiar facts completely unstated. Consider this classic example from the text. Say you want to prove someone has achieved ultimate athletic glory. You might just say, "For he has been victor in the Olympic Games." Notice what's missing? You don't need to explicitly add the premise and the prize for the Olympic Games is a crown. Why? Because the listener naturally adds that familiar fact themselves.
The absolute genius of the enthymeme is that it makes the audience participate in their own persuasion. By leaving out the obvious premise, the listener's brain fills in the gap, and that makes the conclusion feel like it's their own personal discovery.
And this dynamic reveals the two primary logical ways to prove a point in any speech. You either use the example, which is basically rhetorical induction, basing your proof on a bunch of similar past cases, like pointing to historical wars to predict a future one. Or you use the enthymeme, rhetorical deduction, drawing conclusions from probable premises. While examples are incredibly useful as backup evidence, Aristotle actually notes that speeches relying heavily on enthymemes excite the loudest applause from the crowd. And that's exactly because of that active mental engagement we just talked about.
Finally, we hit Section 5, Style and Arrangement. According to the text, good style fundamentally boils down to being clear and appropriate. If it doesn't convey a plain meaning, well, it completely fails its purpose. But there's a really delicate balance here. You have to disguise your art to give the impression that you're speaking completely naturally. Because if you sound too artificial, the audience gets suspicious. They start thinking you're trying to trick them. You secure this clarity by using ordinary, everyday words. However, to keep the speech lively and to convey new ideas promptly, you should leverage metaphors. Metaphors act like a bridge, using a concept the audience already knows to brilliantly illuminate a concept they don't.
When it comes to actually arranging a speech, the writers back in Aristotle's day were obsessed with endlessly complex subdivisions. But Aristotle, he radically strips it down to just two absolute necessities. You have a speech? Fine. First, you must state your case. Second, you must prove it. That's it. You literally cannot state a case without proving it, and you can't prove something you haven't first stated. The statement and the argument are the only truly essential features.
Now, sure, introductions and epilogues exist, but Aristotle views them just as accessories. The epilogue, though, does serve four vital functions if you decide to use it to close things out. First, you've got to make the audience well-disposed to you and ill-disposed to your opponent. Second, you need to magnify or minimize the leading facts to really solidify your case. Third, you must excite the required state of emotion in your hearers, whether that's pity, anger, or emulation. And finally, you conclude with a rapid review to refresh the audience's memory of your main arguments. Ultimately, this whole architectural framework builds up to a really profound justification for studying rhetoric in the first place. Check out this assertion. Rhetoric is useful because things that are true and things that are just have a natural tendency to prevail over their opposites. So the crucial point here is that truth and justice have a natural inherent advantage. They're practically always easier to prove and easier to believe in. Therefore, if a just cause fails in front of a judge or an assembly, the defeat is actually due to the speakers themselves. The speaker's inability to observe the available means of persuasion is entirely to blame.
Which leaves us with this final, genuinely provocative thought. Understanding this blueprint, it isn't just some dusty academic exercise. Aristotle points out how absurd it is for a person to be ashamed of not being able to defend themselves physically, but somehow not ashamed of being unable to defend themselves with speech and reason, which is way more distinctive of who we are as human beings. So ask yourself, if the truth is really on your side, are you actually equipped to defend it? Having the facts is only half the battle. Mastering the faculty of persuasion is what ensures the truth actually prevails. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.